I love this question because behind it I think are various objections that I very personally identify with. Maybe your objections are to do with a big worldview. You discount any kind of spiritual, supernatural events, resurrections, angels, God. There's just no kind of empirical evidence for any of this. So maybe you just write off the Bible because of that. Or maybe for you it's more textual objections. You think, isn't this book full of contradictions? Wasn't it all put together centuries later in some kind of underhand way? What about all those other gospels and texts that seem to be conveniently left out? Or maybe for you it's more moral objections. How can a book that includes genocide and polygamy and slavery, how can this be a holy book? Hasn't this book been used to justify misogyny and abuse? Haven't we progressed a long way from needing a book like this? Well, I couldn't agree more with the principles behind those questions, because I absolutely believe in truth. I don't want anyone to be misled by a book that's really a bunch of fairy tales. I don't want anyone to trust an untrustworthy text. I don't want anyone to base their morals on an immoral text. So I'm really glad to speak to this issue, because I do believe that we can think about this and end up having confidence in this unique book. And we stupidly thought it would be a good idea to deal with this issue in one digestible talk. So all I'm going to do now is just share 4 reasons why we can take the Bible seriously. First, you should take the Bible seriously because of the impact of the Bible. The impact of the Bible is colossal. Here are the top 10 most read books in the world. This is judged on sales from the last 50 years. The zero line is actually here, which shows how far off the scale the Bible is. It has had an exceptional impact on the world. You can feel it in our language. We go the extra mile. We wash our hands of something. There's no peace for the wicked. The Bible has shot through our language, but so much more than that. It's at the level of values and even the whole way we think. Whether we realise it or not, the air that we breathe is biblical. Here's what psychologist Jordan Peterson says: the Bible is, for better or worse, the foundational document of Western civilization, of Western values, Western morality, Western conceptions of good and evil. Its careful, respectful study can reveal things to us about what we believe and how we should act that can be discovered in almost no other manner. Our whole mindset has been deeply shaped by the Bible. And so much so that actually problems we may have with the Bible are actually based on biblical assumptions. So people might accuse the Bible of being non-scientific or being violent or being judgmental. Actually, these challenges are all based on assumptions about what is good, what is individual freedom, what is tolerance, even the scientific endeavour based on the assumption of a divine lawgiver. Our whole way of thinking has been so shaped by the Bible that even our objections are based on the Bible. Non-Christian historian Tom Holland says that the writings of the New Testament are the most influential, the most impactful, the most revolutionary writings that have emerged from the ancient world. It began ripple effects that have spread through the centuries and the millennia, and we still feel their effects today on the way we think. Sometimes it's people outside our culture who can see it more clearly than us. Ayatollah Fadlallah, the late spiritual leader of Hezbollah, and he said this in a conversation with a Christian leader, Brother Andrew. He said, "You Christians have a problem." "What's that?" Brother Andrew said. "You're not following the life of Jesus Christ anymore." Brother Andrew said, "Well, what should we do?" He said, "You must go back to the book." He was addressing Western culture in general. We ought to think twice before severing the branch that we're sitting on. The impact of the Bible has just been colossal, and so it would just be a reasonable thing to do to think about it, to ask why, and to look at the primary source itself. That's one reason to take the Bible seriously. But we should also take the Bible seriously because of the nature of the Bible. Now, what is the Bible? There's quite a bit of ignorance about it. It's just worth flagging up a few facts. There are 66 books compiled into here by about 40 different authors, written over 1,500 years. Many different locations, 3 main different languages. It's pretty big. We get deceived by these tiny little editions with the tiny font and the really thin paper. It's really this big. That's a slightly more understandable way of putting it together, which is almost as long as the Harry Potter series. It's about that kind of length. And what are all these writings in the Bible doing in one compilation? Well, they are telling one epic story. It is the epic of all epics, the story of how the creator of all things made a plan and acted it out to save a people in love. It's all very interconnected. You could say it's like a Wikipedia page full of hyperlinks. This beautiful infographic shows actually how all the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus came true in the New Testament, beautifully connected. So jumping in, say, one of the Gospels in the New Testament is a bit like jumping into book 4 of Harry Potter. It assumes what's come before it. It all hangs together. Now, when I see an ad on Instagram that says, "This gadget will change your life," how do I respond to that? I'll probably swipe right past it. But if I get a letter through the door from my GP saying, "This gadget may save your life," I'll take that a lot more seriously. Because any text we come across, we consider who's it come from, who's it for, what's its purpose. And if we do that responsibly, properly, with the various texts in the Bible, it really helps us to understand what's going on. It's what they call genre in literary studies, a form of writing. Dr. Bill Allen, a fellow in classics at Oxford, says, "We can understand an ancient literary text properly only if we take into account where it comes in the evolution of its genre." This is hugely important with the Bible, because within this book we have laws, we have narratives, we have poems, songs, all kinds of different forms of writing. And we need to read them each according to their genre. Why does this all matter? Well, it helps us deal with many of the moral objections. So sometimes people take issue with polygamy, for instance. Now, there are New Testament texts that are letters to groups of Christians clearly instructing them how to live. Things like don't lie to each other. And that's clearly a command to be obeyed. But there are other texts that are narrative, for instance, Genesis. And there you might read about someone like Jacob who marries 2 sisters. And you could say, well, that's promoting polygamy. I've got a big problem with that. But actually, if you read it according to its genre as a narrative, an unfolding story where you learn from the characters, you see that this is not an exemplary way to live at all, and it just ends in misery. We need to read the Bible according to the various genres within it. Remember Instagram and the GP's letter, we do this all the time. This also helps with apparent discrepancies. So if you think of John's Gospel, it famously says, God so loved the world that he gave his son. But then in the same writer, John, one of his letters, he tells people, don't love the world, or the love of the Father is not in you. You think, well, clearly that's a contradiction. Well, many skilled writers will use seeming contradictions, even intentional contradictions, to make you think about the meaning of the words. Think of Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, as he begins A Tale of Two Cities. Is he contradicting himself? Well, he's using paradox. He's using a kind of intentional contradiction to help you consider what he means. Many Bible writers do the same. Sometimes events seem to differ in their details, though. This gives a field day to critics of the Bible, people who want to find objections to it. You get writers like Bart Ehrman. He wrote Jesus Interrupted, revealing the hidden contradictions in the Bible and why we don't know about them. In the promotional video on Amazon, he quotes one of the discrepancies that he refers to in his book. Mark's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, their portrayals of Jesus being crucified, he says that they're not simply discrepancies, they're entirely different portrayals. He says Jesus dies in despair in Mark, but as one in control in Luke. These are diverse and contradictory portrayals. Now, what he's doing is leaving you with the impression that events connected to these things might have happened, but the accounts we have are so different that we can't really know what actually happens. He talks about how in Mark's Gospel, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" in despair, whereas in Luke he says, "Father, into your hand I commit my spirit," seemingly much more at peace. But this is a false dichotomy. If you look more closely at the texts, you'll see that actually, as almost all scholars agree, Luke used Mark as a primary material. Further, Luke speaks of a second cry in his accounts, which could well be the one in Mark. Even in Mark's Gospel, yes, Jesus is suffering greatly, but he actually supplies the testimony that condemns him, as well as predicting his death 3 times. So to say that in one he's in control and the other he's in total despair is to drastically oversimplify these very nuanced and carefully written accounts. We need to read the Bible properly, according to its genres, keeping context in mind. It's exactly what we would do with any piece of literature. Now, if you're feeling cynical, you could pick holes in anything. It's what journalists do every day. But it's reasonable, it's rational, it's sensible to read a text on its own terms. I'd encourage you to do the same with the Bible. Taking all these things into proper consideration, I'd challenge you to present a contradiction or discrepancy that can't be resolved. I urge you to read it. The more you do, the more you'll be captivated by what it says. We can also take the Bible seriously because of the reliability of the Bible. It's true that some people believe the Bible without really thinking about its reliability. It's also true that many disbelieve the Bible without thinking about its reliability. Skeptics may rule the headlines like Chris Hitchens or Sam Harris, but they don't rule the academy. You get writers like Michael Onfray, the French philosopher, who says Jesus' existence has not been historically established. No contemporary documentation of the event, no archaeological proof, nothing certain exists today. It's simply not what leading voices in the academy say. E.P. Sanders is one of the most highly respected New Testament scholars, and he puts it like this: there are no substantial doubts about the general course of Jesus' life, when and where he lived, approximately when and where he died, and the sort of thing that he did during his public activity. Don't be deceived by the scintillating headlines. Is it a bunch of fairy tales? Think about how fairy tales begin. A long time ago, in a place far away. Consider how Luke begins his gospel. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. As he goes on, he records details like this. This is chapter 3. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. These are eyewitness historical accounts. Now, an enormous amount of research has gone into the accuracy, the reliability of the biblical documents. And it's fascinating and very telling to compare what we have for the Bible with other ancient documents. Now, there are 2 key factors when it comes to discerning the reliability of a text. One is the time frame between the original writing and the earliest manuscripts we have. And the other is the number of manuscripts we have. If you only have a few, how do you know which one is original? If you have hundreds or thousands, you can tell which ones have been corrupted or changed and which ones are what the author wrote. Now compare what we have with the Bible with other ancient texts. You look at something like Homer's Iliad or Caesar's Gallic Wars, you're looking at hundreds of years, sometimes almost 1,000 years of a time gap between when the text was supposed to have been written and the earliest copies we have. And then the number of manuscripts, maybe a few hundreds, maybe 1,000 or 2. It doesn't come close to what we have with the New Testament. Now, any of these ancient texts, we don't have what's called the autograph, the original handwritten text. Of course not, it's thousands of years ago. All we have is copies, and we have to determine how accurate are the copies. Can we discern what was originally written? And the New Testament is streets ahead of any other ancient text. In fact, we have so many manuscripts with so many pages that you could pile them up And look at this. The average ancient text would just be a few feet tall. The New Testament would be a mile high. The whole Bible, 2.5 miles. We've just got an extraordinary amount of manuscript evidence for the text in the Bible. Plenty to assure us of what was originally written. There's lots more you can look into about all this. I'm going to post some links in the comments of the video. Again, I would urge you to read it. Start with one of the Gospels. It's the easiest entry point, and you will see how these are compelling eyewitness stories. The details, the corroboration of other extra-biblical sources gives us total confidence in what we read. You can take it seriously. And lastly, you can take the Bible seriously because of the message of the Bible. I love the Jason Bourne films. Do you remember the first one, Bourne Identity? This mysterious figure, Jason Bourne, great initials by the way, he finds himself desperately wounded and totally amnesic. He doesn't have a clue who he is. And yet he discovers that he's very skilled, he's got great strength, he must be some kind of spy or combat fighter. He needs to work out who he is. How did he get here? What's the story? What explains his identity? Well, it's a compelling illustration of the human conundrum. Who are we? Why do we have these capabilities, these skills, these strengths? What are we here for? What's the story? And so I want to ask you, what is the story for you? How do you make sense of the world? To cope with the scale of these questions, we have to come up with some kind of meta-narrative that explains the reason for our existence. Some find a religious meta-narrative, some look for a socio-political narrative, some focus more individually on happiness and freedom. What is the story that you think best makes sense of the world? Mahatma Gandhi said about the Bible, "You Christians look after a document containing enough dynamite to blow all civilization to pieces, to turn the world upside down and bring peace to a battle-torn planet. But you treat it as though it's nothing more than a piece of literature." He's right, the Bible does have that kind of power. It's the great eternal story of God loving the world, entering into it, lowering himself to become a slave to save us. This book is not primarily a moral code, but a great story. The great story. It's the ultimate story of triumph through adversity, of hope in the midst of despair. Now you hear echoes of this story in all kinds of other stories, all the way down to Batman films or Disney films. It's rags to riches, it's the prince marries the pauper, it's living happily ever after in the end, it's defeating dragons. Now, does this all sound a bit like fairy tales? Yes, it does, and that's the point. C.S. Lewis was one of the greatest literary minds ever. He objected to the Gospels, assuming they were just more myths, until he looked at them carefully. His great friend, J.R.R. Tolkien, encouraged him to read them. He said, "I've read a great deal of legends, and I am quite clear that they are not the same kind of thing." What he saw when he read the Gospels was a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference, that it really happens. It's the grand story that makes sense of all other stories. Well, let me end with something that is utterly unique about this book. This book claims to be not only human words, but also divine words. Now you might think that's not unique, isn't that what all holy books say? But it's not actually. The Bible doesn't claim to be mere dictation, like the Quran, God speaking and saying, write this down. Nor does it claim to be like the Book of Mormon, somehow just appears after being buried, strangely, for 2,000 years in a language that no one knows. No, it's so much more human than that. These are human writings with human styles, human languages, different human characters, about human history and real human events. And yet the Bible says that God was overseeing all of this. 2 Peter 1:21 says that prophets, though human, spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. What we have here, yes, they're human words, and they are also God speaking. Will you read it and will you listen? You will hear God speak. we can take the Bible seriously. The impact of the Bible is colossal. The nature of the Bible is extraordinary, nuanced, carefully written literature. The reliability of the Bible is exceptional. The message of the Bible is totally compelling. Why not have a read? And maybe that you don't know where to start. I'd encourage you to start with the Gospel. It's fairly familiar and easy to get your head around. You could join a course. We run things like Christianity Explored, just a few weeks on Zoom, and we'll read Mark's Gospel and discuss it together. If you've got a Christian friend, why not chat to them about what you could read and where to start? We can take the Bible seriously. We must take the Bible seriously.